Before you decide who deserves sympathy in a divorce, make sure you know who was carrying the weight all along. Those were the words I spoke in a packed courtroom on a gray Thursday morning in Dallas, Texas, and for the first time all day, nobody moved. Not Rebecca. Not her attorney. Not even Judge Harrison Blake. The air seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. I sat in a wheelchair at the defense table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, looking exactly like the broken man everyone expected me to be. Rebecca certainly believed it. She sat 20 feet away in a tailored navy suit, confident and composed, the expression on her face already halfway to victory. To her, this hearing was nothing more than a final formality. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Months telling people I had become a burden. Months explaining why she deserved a better life. Months convincing everyone around her that leaving a disabled husband wasn't cruel, it was necessary. And judging by the sympathetic looks from several people in the gallery, her story had worked. The truth is, if I had been sitting where they were sitting, I might have believed it too. After all, appearances matter. And appearances told a simple story. A successful businessman suffers a devastating accident. He loses his mobility. His marriage collapses. His wife decides she can't spend the rest of her life taking care of someone who can no longer keep up. Clean. Simple. Understandable. Except real life rarely fits inside neat little boxes. The truth was far messier. I glanced toward Rebecca. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me once since entering the courtroom. Instead, she kept her attention fixed on her attorney, occasionally nodding as he reviewed documents stacked neatly across the table. There was confidence in every movement. Confidence that comes from believing you've already won. I remembered that confidence. I'd seen it before. The day she handed me divorce papers. The day she called me deadweight. The day she told me she refused to spend the rest of her life tied to a man in a wheelchair. Funny thing about confidence. It can make smart people blind. Judge Blake adjusted his glasses and reviewed the final page in front of him. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across polished wood and brass fixtures. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair creaked. Outside, rain tapped gently against the courthouse windows. Everything felt ordinary. Quiet. Controlled. But beneath that calm surface, something else was moving. Something Rebecca couldn't see. Something she never even thought to look for. Her attorney stood and launched into another summary of their claims. Assets. Investments. Properties. Business interests. Numbers floated through the room like confetti. Millions here. Millions there. Every sentence painted the same picture. Rebecca had supposedly helped build my success and deserved a significant share of everything attached to it. I listened without interruption. No anger. No frustration. No visible reaction at all. Years ago, I might have argued. Years ago, I might have fought to defend myself. But experience teaches a man that timing matters more than volume. Sometimes the strongest move is silence. Sometimes you let people finish telling the story they've created before introducing them to reality. The attorney finally sat down. Rebecca folded her arms. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. She looked relieved. Almost happy. Judge Blake turned toward me. Mr. Cole, is there anything you'd like to say before the court reaches a decision? The question hung in the room. Every eye shifted toward me. I could feel the attention settling across my shoulders. Slowly, I rolled forward a few inches and cleared my throat. My voice came out calm. Steady. The way steel sounds before it bends. Yes, Your Honor, I said. Before you decide, I'd like 60 seconds. The room went completely still. Rebecca finally looked at me. And when she did, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Uncertainty. Because what she didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that the wheelchair wasn't the biggest secret I had been carrying. Nobody starts a marriage expecting to someday sit across from the person they love in a courtroom. Looking back, that is probably why the warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive quietly. Small enough to ignore. Ordinary enough to explain away. Years before any of this happened, before the wheelchair, before the lawyers, before the silence that eventually settled between us, my life looked like something out of a magazine article about the American dream. I was 30 years old when I launched my first company. The office was barely bigger than a two-car garage on the edge of Fort Worth. We had folding tables, second-hand computers, and a coffee machine that worked only when it felt like it. Most mornings I unlocked the front door before sunrise and left long after dark. I did not have investors. I did not have family money. What I had was stubbornness and the belief that if I worked hard enough, eventually something would give. For years, that was enough. 1 contract became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became more than I could count without looking at spreadsheets. Every dollar went back into the business. Every late night felt like another brick in a foundation nobody could see yet. That was around the time I met Rebecca. She was smart, confident, and impossible to ignore. The first thing I noticed was her laugh. The second thing was how easily she could make an entire room pay attention without raising her voice. Back then she believed in me long before there was anything impressive to believe in. At least that is what I thought. We met through mutual friends at a restaurant near downtown Dallas. I remember driving home that night in an aging pickup truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer and thinking about her smile the entire way. Some memories stay sharp no matter how many years pass. That one never faded. We married 3 years later. The ceremony was small. Nothing extravagant. Just family, close friends, and a warm Texas afternoon that felt like it would last forever. Those early years were good years. Not perfect. Real marriages never are. But they were honest. We shared tiny apartments, take-out dinners, and dreams that seemed bigger than our bank accounts. When business was slow, Rebecca told me not to worry. When deals fell apart, she reminded me why I started. I believed we were building something together. Maybe that was true once. The company kept growing. So did our lifestyle. The apartment became a house. The house became a larger house. Vacations that once required months of planning became spontaneous weekend trips. New opportunities arrived faster than I could process them. From the outside, everything looked successful. Inside, I was still the same man waking up before dawn thinking about payroll, contracts, and responsibilities. Success does not make problems disappear. It simply changes their size. The strange thing is that when people look back at a failed marriage, they search for a single moment where everything went wrong. A dramatic event. A turning point. Reality is usually quieter. It happens inch by inch. Conversation by conversation. Missed dinner by missed dinner. Looking back now, I realize the first cracks appeared long before either of us acknowledged them. Rebecca started caring more about appearances. Social circles expanded. Charity galas replaced quiet evenings at home. Conversations that once centered around family and goals slowly shifted toward status, recognition, and comparisons. Nothing alarming. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make me occasionally wonder why I felt lonelier sitting beside my wife than I did sitting alone in my office. At the time I blamed work. Most men do. It is easier to believe you are simply busy than to admit something important is changing. I told myself things would improve once life slowed down. What I did not know was that life was about to change in ways neither of us could have imagined. And when it did, the person I trusted most would reveal a side of herself I had never seen before. The morning everything changed started like hundreds of mornings before it. I woke up before sunrise, poured a cup of coffee, and stood on the back patio watching the first light spill across the yard. The Texas air was cool for late spring, carrying that brief calm that disappears once the afternoon heat arrives. Rebecca was still asleep upstairs. My phone already buzzed with emails from clients on the East Coast. Another busy day. Another long schedule. Nothing about that morning felt unusual. If someone had told me my entire life was about to split into a before and an after, I would have laughed. That is the strange thing about life. The biggest changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly and then refuse to leave. I spent most of the day meeting with investors and reviewing expansion plans for one of our largest projects. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of polished steel. Dark clouds gathered across the horizon, thick and heavy. Around 6 o'clock I finally headed home. Traffic crawled along Interstate 30. Headlights reflected off damp pavement. The radio hummed softly in the background while I thought about nothing more complicated than getting home in time for dinner. Looking back now, that ordinary thought feels almost painful. There is something cruel about how normal life feels right before it changes forever. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a hospital room. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just fragments. White ceilings. Machines humming somewhere nearby. The smell of disinfectant. Voices speaking in low tones. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I tried to move. That was when fear arrived. Not panic. Not terror. Something colder. Something quieter. My legs felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. I remember staring at the blanket covering them and willing myself to move. Nothing happened. A doctor eventually stepped into the room. He looked tired, the way doctors often do when they have difficult conversations ahead of them. Rebecca sat beside the bed holding my hand. Her eyes were red from crying. For a moment I felt relieved. Whatever had happened, we would get through it together. That was what marriage meant. At least that was what I still believed. The doctor explained the injuries carefully. There would be surgeries. Rehabilitation. Months of recovery. Maybe longer. Nobody could guarantee what the future would look like. He spoke with the measured optimism of a man trying to balance hope with honesty. Then came the sentence that stayed with me. There is a possibility you may never regain full mobility. The room seemed to shrink around those words. I did not shout. I did not break down. I simply stared through the window beside my bed at a gray Dallas sky and wondered what my life would look like if the doctor was right. The days that followed blurred together. Physical therapy evaluations. Specialists. Medications. Endless tests. Every morning became a small battle against limitations I had never imagined. Tasks that once required no thought suddenly demanded effort. Patience became a full-time job. Some days were encouraging. Others felt impossible. Through it all, Rebecca stayed beside me. At least physically. She attended appointments. Answered questions. Smiled when nurses entered the room. From the outside she looked like the devoted wife everyone expected her to be. But something had changed. I noticed it in the quiet moments. The pauses that lasted a second too long. The distant look in her eyes when she thought I was not paying attention. The conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. I told myself she was exhausted. Scared. Overwhelmed. I wanted to believe that. The alternative was too painful to consider. Then one evening, nearly 3 months after the accident, I caught my reflection in a hospital window. For a moment I barely recognized the man staring back at me. And what frightened me most was not what I saw in myself. It was the realization that Rebecca was starting to see that man differently too. Recovery teaches you things success never will. It teaches patience. It teaches humility. And sometimes it teaches you exactly who is standing beside you when there is nothing left to gain. 6 months after the accident, I was finally back home. The hospital was behind me. The surgeries were behind me. The endless rows of machines and white walls had been replaced by familiar furniture and family photographs. On paper, that should have felt like a victory. Instead, the house felt different. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone had quietly removed the warmth while nobody was looking. At first I blamed myself. Most men do. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself Rebecca was tired from carrying more responsibility. I told myself any marriage would struggle under pressure like this. But explanations only work for so long before reality starts speaking louder. The first thing that changed was conversation. We used to talk about everything. Business. Travel. Weekend plans. Stupid things we saw online. Now our conversations revolved around schedules, appointments, and necessities. Functional. Efficient. Empty. It felt less like a marriage and more like a business arrangement neither of us remembered signing. Then came the invitations. Charity events. Corporate dinners. Social gatherings. For years we attended together. Suddenly she began going alone. The explanations always sounded reasonable. You need to rest. It will be crowded. It will be uncomfortable for you. At first I agreed. Then I noticed a pattern. The invitations never stopped arriving. I simply stopped being included. One evening I watched her leave for a fundraising gala downtown. She stood in front of the hallway mirror adjusting an elegant black dress while I sat in the living room reviewing company reports. For a moment she looked exactly like the woman I married. Then she glanced toward me and something shifted in her expression. Not anger. Not sadness. Something worse. Embarrassment. The look disappeared almost instantly, but I saw it. Once you see something like that, you cannot pretend it never happened. The front door closed behind her a few minutes later. The silence that followed felt heavier than the wheelchair beneath me. Looking back, that was when I truly understood something was wrong. Not because of what she said. Because of what she stopped saying. Weeks passed. Then months. Physical therapy became my routine. Every small improvement felt earned. Every extra step during rehabilitation felt like a victory nobody else could see. But the stronger I became physically, the more distant Rebecca seemed emotionally. It was as if my struggle reminded her of something she wanted to escape. One afternoon I returned home early from therapy. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The house smelled faintly of coffee and expensive perfume. Rebecca did not know I was back. As I moved through the hallway, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. She had 2 friends visiting. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I was simply there before they realized it. At first the conversation sounded harmless. Casual laughter. Small talk. Then I heard my name. The room went quiet for a second. One of her friends asked how things were going. Rebecca sighed. The kind of sigh people use when discussing an inconvenience. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. She said, "Sometimes I feel like my life ended the day of that accident." Nobody responded immediately. Even her friends seemed uncomfortable. Rebecca continued speaking. She talked about sacrifices. Missed opportunities. The future she thought she would have. Every sentence felt calm. Reasonable. Measured. That was what made it hurt. There was no cruelty in her voice. Just disappointment. As if I had somehow become a problem she never intended to inherit. I backed away before anyone saw me. Quietly. Slowly. The rain outside seemed louder now. I sat alone in my office for nearly an hour staring at family photographs lined across a bookshelf. The smiles in those pictures belonged to strangers. Somewhere between those moments and now, something important had disappeared. What I did not know then was that Rebecca had already started making plans for a future that no longer included me. People imagine that the end of a marriage arrives with shouting, slammed doors, and dramatic confrontations. Mine arrived in complete silence. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 11 months after the accident. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows. A lawn crew worked somewhere down the street. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air. Everything felt ordinary. That was the unsettling part. Rebecca walked into my office carrying a manila envelope. She was dressed for lunch with friends, perfectly composed, perfectly prepared. For a brief second, I thought it was another set of financial documents. Another routine task. Then she placed the envelope on my desk and stepped back. Her expression told me everything before I even opened it. Divorce papers have a strange weight to them. The stack was not particularly thick, yet it felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed. I looked down at the first page. My name appeared at the top. Rebecca's name followed beneath it. Years of memories suddenly reduced to legal language and numbered paragraphs. I expected anger. I expected disappointment. Instead, I felt something almost peaceful. The kind of calm that arrives when reality finally catches up with suspicion. Looking back, I think part of me had been preparing for that moment long before it arrived. Rebecca folded her arms and waited. Not nervously. Confidently. Like someone presenting a completed project. When I finally looked up, she spoke before I could. She said we both deserved a chance to move forward. She said life had changed. She said neither of us should spend the next 20 years trapped by circumstances we never chose. The words sounded thoughtful. Reasonable. Carefully rehearsed. Then came the sentence I never forgot. She looked directly at me and said, "I cannot keep carrying dead weight through the rest of my life." The room seemed quieter afterward. Even the ticking clock on the wall felt distant. For a moment neither of us spoke. I simply studied her face. This was the same woman who once sat beside me in a tiny apartment eating takeout on folding chairs. The same woman who promised we would face every challenge together. Yet standing there now, she looked like a stranger wearing familiar features. What surprised her was my reaction. I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not ask for another chance. I simply nodded and turned another page. Confusion flickered across her face. She had expected resistance. Most people do when they prepare for a fight. What they never expect is surrender. The truth was I had already lost something far more valuable than the marriage itself. I had lost the illusion that we were still on the same side. Once that illusion disappears, everything else becomes easier to understand. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca transformed into someone astonishingly efficient. Attorneys appeared. Financial requests arrived. Asset inventories were demanded. Every conversation suddenly revolved around numbers. Houses. Investments. Equity. Ownership percentages. It felt less like ending a marriage and more like conducting an audit. What fascinated me was how confident everyone seemed. Rebecca's attorney carried himself like a man already celebrating victory. Their assumptions were obvious. Successful entrepreneur. Significant holdings. Long marriage. Substantial settlement. The equation appeared simple. They believed they understood the board. What they did not understand was that they were looking at only half of it. One afternoon I sat across from my attorney, Michael Sterling, in his downtown office overlooking the Dallas skyline. Rain streaked slowly across the windows while traffic crawled below. Michael reviewed the latest filing and then looked at me over the top of his glasses. "You know they think this is going to be straightforward," he said. I smiled for the first time in months. "I know," I answered. He studied me for a moment before returning the smile. Neither of us said anything else. We did not need to. Because hidden behind years of business decisions, legal structures, and documents nobody had bothered to examine closely, a different story was waiting. And sooner or later, that story was going to walk into a courtroom. Most people think wealth is measured by what they can see. The house on the hill. The luxury vehicles in the driveway. The balance printed on a financial statement. That assumption is exactly why so many people misunderstand how real businesses work. Long before my marriage began falling apart, I learned a lesson from an older mentor. He once told me that if you build something valuable, protect it before anyone gives you a reason to. At the time I thought he was talking about competitors. Lawsuits. Economic downturns. I never imagined the advice would someday protect me from someone sitting across my own dinner table. Nearly 15 years before the divorce, my company reached a point where growth started attracting attention. New investors called weekly. Competitors watched every move. Attorneys filled my calendar with meetings about risk management and long-term planning. Back then I was still young enough to believe success alone solved problems. Experience taught me otherwise. Success simply creates different problems. That was when Michael Sterling first entered my life. Before becoming my divorce attorney, he was one of the sharpest business attorneys in Texas. We spent months restructuring ownership, creating holding companies, and establishing legal protections designed to preserve long-term stability. None of it felt dramatic. Most of it was paperwork. Endless meetings inside conference rooms overlooking downtown Dallas. Coffee growing cold while accountants discussed percentages and attorneys debated language buried inside documents nobody would ever read voluntarily. At the time it felt boring. Looking back, it may have been one of the smartest decisions I ever made. The structure eventually became simple. Operational assets existed in one place. Ownership interests existed somewhere else. Long-term holdings were protected through legal entities designed specifically for continuity and preservation. Everything was legitimate. Everything was disclosed where required. Everything followed the law. Most importantly, everything had been established years before any trouble appeared in my marriage. Rebecca knew I had businesses. She knew I owned investments. She knew the company was successful. What she never cared to understand was how everything actually worked. During the good years she rarely asked questions. During the difficult years she asked only one kind of question. How much is it worth? Looking back, that difference says more than I realized at the time. As the divorce process accelerated, financial requests multiplied. Statements were demanded. Asset lists expanded. Accountants exchanged emails. Attorneys reviewed disclosures. Rebecca appeared energized by the process. The woman who once seemed bored discussing business suddenly wanted details about every property, every investment, every ownership interest. It was like watching someone study a treasure map without realizing half the landmarks were missing. One afternoon Michael and I sat in his office reviewing another round of filings. Sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers while helicopters drifted across the distant skyline. He closed a folder and leaned back in his chair. "She keeps assuming everything is personal property," he said. "That assumption is doing a lot of heavy lifting." I laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh I had experienced in months. Not because anyone was suffering. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for the first time since the accident, I realized I was no longer reacting to events. I was prepared for them. There is a difference. One leaves you feeling helpless. The other leaves you feeling calm. Meanwhile, Rebecca grew increasingly confident. Friends told her she would walk away with a fortune. Advisors reinforced her expectations. Even her attorney began speaking with the certainty of someone already calculating percentages. The strange thing about confidence is that it often grows strongest right before reality arrives. I never corrected anyone. I never argued. I never hinted that their assumptions were wrong. Silence can be remarkably useful when other people are busy writing their own ending. By the time the court date approached, Rebecca believed she understood exactly how the story would end. What she did not realize was that the most important documents in the entire case had not yet been discussed. And when those documents finally appeared, every assumption supporting her confidence would begin to collapse. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the weight of expectations pressing against every wall. Or maybe it was because everyone inside that room believed they already knew how the story ended. Judge Harrison Blake sat quietly reviewing the final documents stacked before him. Rebecca remained confident. Her attorney appeared relaxed. Even the spectators watching from the gallery carried the subtle expression people wear when they think the outcome is obvious. I sat at my table and listened to the soft hum of the air conditioning. Outside, rain tapped gently against the courthouse windows. Inside, millions of dollars and years of assumptions hung in the balance. When Judge Blake asked whether I had anything further to present, the room turned toward me. That was the moment where the past and present finally collided. I glanced toward Michael Sterling. He gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet confirmation. We had reached the point we had been preparing for from the very beginning. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. There is one document the court has not yet reviewed. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair. Her attorney frowned. For the first time all morning, uncertainty entered the room. Michael stood and approached the bench carrying a single folder. It was not large. It was not impressive. Just a plain folder filled with pages that looked no different from countless other legal documents. Yet I knew those pages contained more power than anything discussed during the previous 6 hours. The clerk accepted the folder and delivered it to the judge. Silence followed. Not complete silence. The kind of silence filled with quiet breathing, rustling paper, and people wondering what they were missing. Judge Blake opened the file and began reading. His expression remained neutral at first. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. A few pages later he adjusted his glasses and started reading more carefully. Rebecca noticed the change immediately. So did her attorney. I watched both of them straighten in their seats. The confidence that had carried them through the hearing began to weaken. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like sunlight fading before a storm. Several minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. The judge continued turning pages. Finally he looked up. Mr. Sterling, he said, am I correct in understanding that these ownership structures were established more than a decade before the filing of this divorce? Yes, Your Honor, Michael replied. 14 years ago. The judge nodded slowly. Another page turned. Another long pause followed. Rebecca looked toward her attorney. Her attorney quickly reviewed his notes, then requested a moment to examine the documents himself. The request was granted. What happened next reminded me of watching someone discover they had been studying the wrong map. He read quickly at first. Then slower. Then he started flipping backward through the pages to confirm details he clearly wished were different. His confidence evaporated one paragraph at a time. Rebecca leaned closer, whispering questions. He did not answer immediately. That silence told her more than words ever could. The truth was surprisingly simple. The core ownership interests were never personal marital assets. The holding structures had been created years before any marital conflict existed. The protections were legal, documented, and thoroughly established. What Rebecca believed she was dividing did not legally exist in the form she imagined. The assumptions supporting her entire strategy began collapsing under the weight of actual documentation. Judge Blake eventually placed the folder down and folded his hands. The room felt frozen. Based on these records, he said carefully, the court will need to reconsider substantial portions of the requested asset division. Rebecca's face lost color. Not because she suddenly hated me. Not because she regretted leaving. But because reality had arrived without warning. For months she had been calculating a future built on expectations. In less than 10 minutes those expectations were gone. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply sat quietly and watched the truth do what arguments never could. Sometimes the loudest moment in a person's life arrives without anyone raising their voice. And as the judge continued reviewing the implications of the documents before him, I realized something important. The wheelchair had never been my greatest disadvantage. Their certainty had been theirs. People assume victory feels explosive. They imagine celebration, satisfaction, maybe even revenge. The truth is much quieter. When the hearing finally ended, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man who had been carrying a heavy weight for so long that he barely noticed when it was finally removed. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. Thin rays of afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected off the glass towers surrounding downtown Dallas. Michael Sterling walked beside me toward the parking area. He looked pleased, but not surprised. That was one of the things I respected most about him. He never confused preparation with luck. As we reached the curb, he glanced at me and smiled. You know, he said, most people spend years trying to learn that lesson. I asked him which lesson. He looked toward the skyline before answering. The difference between what people think they know and what is actually true. Then he shook my hand and headed toward his car. I sat there for a moment watching traffic move through the city. The strange thing was that my thoughts were not focused on Rebecca. They were focused on the future. For the first time since the accident, the future no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something I could build again. The months that followed became some of the most demanding months of my life. Not because of business. Because of recovery. Physical therapy had always been difficult. After the divorce proceedings ended, it became personal. Every morning began before sunrise. While most of the city slept, I was already working through exercises, stretching routines, and rehabilitation sessions. Progress arrived slowly. Painfully slowly. The kind of progress that would seem invisible to anyone looking from the outside. But I noticed. One additional step. A little more balance. A little more strength. Recovery is not dramatic. It is repetitive. Thousands of small victories stacked on top of each other until one day they become impossible to ignore. During that same period, business continued moving forward. The company never stopped growing. New projects broke ground across Texas. Expansion plans that had been delayed after the accident resumed. Executives flew in for meetings. Investors requested updates. Opportunities continued appearing. The difference now was my perspective. Before the accident, success often felt like a race. Bigger contracts. Bigger goals. Bigger numbers. After everything that happened, I started measuring success differently. Peace became valuable. Time became valuable. Loyalty became priceless. One morning nearly 8 months after the court ruling, I arrived at the rehabilitation center earlier than usual. The facility was quiet. Sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking a parking lot lined with oak trees. My therapist handed me a pair of forearm crutches and asked if I was ready to try something new. Looking back, that moment felt insignificant. At the time, it felt enormous. I stood carefully. Slowly. Every movement demanded concentration. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then I took a step. It was not graceful. It was not impressive. But it was mine. Another step followed. Then another. Across the polished floor, I moved forward one deliberate step at a time. The distance could not have been more than 20 feet. Yet it felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. When I finally reached the opposite wall, emotion hit me unexpectedly. Not because I had walked. Because I realized how close I had come to believing my story was over. For a long time I thought recovery meant returning to the man I was before the accident. I understand now that recovery is something entirely different. It means becoming someone stronger because of what happened, not despite it. Later that afternoon I stood in my office overlooking the Dallas skyline. The city stretched toward the horizon beneath a bright blue Texas sky. Construction cranes dotted the distance. Cars moved along highways like streams of light. Life continued. It always does. I placed both hands against the glass and allowed myself a rare moment of gratitude. The accident had taken things from me. The divorce had taken things from me. But neither had taken everything. And for the first time in years, I understood that the best chapters of my life might still be waiting ahead. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I received a phone call I never expected. I was finishing a meeting at the office when my assistant informed me that someone was waiting downstairs. She sounded hesitant. Almost curious. When I asked who it was, she simply said, "Rebecca." For a few seconds I stared out the window at the Dallas skyline. The city stretched beneath a bright afternoon sky. Construction cranes dotted the horizon. Traffic moved steadily along the highways. Life looked exactly the way it should. Forward. I took the elevator down and found her sitting alone in the lobby. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly was gone. Time had not been cruel to her. Life had. There is a difference. She looked tired. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally worn down. The kind of look people get when reality turns out differently than they expected. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she stood and offered a small smile. It reminded me of someone trying to unlock a door with a key that no longer fits. We sat across from each other in a quiet conference room overlooking the city. The silence between us felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Eventually she spoke. She told me she had made mistakes. She admitted she had spent years chasing an image of happiness instead of understanding what happiness actually was. She talked about poor decisions. Disappointments. Expectations that never became reality. I listened without interrupting. Age teaches you that not every conversation requires an argument. Sometimes people simply need to tell the truth, even if they discover it too late. Finally she looked directly at me and asked the question I think she had been carrying for months. "Do you think there was ever a chance we could have fixed it?" The city seemed unusually quiet after she asked that. I looked out the window for a moment before answering. The truth deserved honesty. "Maybe," I said. "But not after you stopped seeing me as a person." Her eyes dropped toward the table. I continued carefully. "The accident changed my life. But it did not change who I was. Somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing the man and started seeing the wheelchair." She nodded slowly. There was no anger in the room. No bitterness. Just acceptance. Sometimes the hardest lessons arrive after the test is already over. A few minutes later we stood. She thanked me for meeting with her. I thanked her for being honest. Then we walked toward the lobby together. At the entrance she stopped and looked back. For a brief second I saw the woman I married years ago. Not the woman who left. Not the woman who sat across from me in court. Just a memory standing in the sunlight. Then she smiled softly and walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd outside before turning back toward the elevators. There was no dramatic ending. No final victory speech. No revenge. Life rarely works that way. What remained was something far more valuable. Peace. The accident taught me that strength is not measured by how much weight you can lift. The divorce taught me that loyalty cannot be measured by how long someone stays when life is easy. And recovery taught me that sometimes the person who saves your future is the person you become after everything falls apart. Today, when I look across the city from my office window, I do not think about what I lost. I think about what I learned. Because losing the wrong people often makes room for the right life. And if there is one thing I hope this story proves, it is that your worst chapter does not have to be your final chapter. Sometimes it is simply the page that forces a better story to begin. I would love to know your thoughts. If you were in my position, could you have forgiven Rebecca, or would you have made the same choice? Share your perspective in the comments because every story teaches something different. And if stories about resilience, second chances, and overcoming life's toughest moments speak to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next journey. Until then, remember this: never let someone else's opinion decide your worth. The people who underestimate you are often the same people who never took the time to truly know you.